He pinched the bridge of his nose and tried to imagine how nice another cigarette would taste. "Well?" "Councilman Robinson, my cell phone has not stopped ringing for 10 days now. I have no idea how many calls I've missed, but I'm sure it's a bunch. So tell me, what can I do for you?" Robinson huffed indignantly. "Look, I'm sure you people are real busy down there." "You have no idea," Shaw said. "Yes, well, things are rough all over the city. Do you know what we're dealing with out here?" Maids who can't make it to work, probably, Shaw thought, and smiled for the first time in 10 days. Councilman Evan Robinson lived in the River Oaks subdivision, Texas's answer to Beverly Hills. It was, Shaw had heard, the wealthiest zip code in Texas, and the second wealthiest in the country. They had mansions there bigger than the elementary school where his wife Grace had taught for 25 years. Old Texas oil money at its most decadent. River Oaks was built well beyond the flood zone. Shaw searched his memory for the last action reports he'd read on the area, and couldn't come up with anything beyond the common nuisances that came with any bad weather incident. "I guess you've got a few down power lines, water service interrupted, roads closed, some property damage from airborne tree limbs. That about cover it?" "As a matter of fact, no, Captain. That doesn't about cover it." Shaw didn't have time for the other shoe to drop. "Okay," he said. Robinson huffed again, and Shaw had to smile at the mental image playing through his mind. Robinson was an effeminate man, delicately built, prissy, hardly what you'd expect from a family that grew out of Old West pioneers and wildcatter stock. Shaw could almost picture the man pushing the gold-rimmed glasses back up his nose while trying to hold on to his patience with both hands. "Look here, Shaw. You know what a lift pump station is?" "Yes, sir." "So you know what happens when a lift pump station gets its electrical power knocked out?" "Yes, sir, I do." The city of Houston had been dredged from a swamp back in the early 1800s. As it grew, it was forced to come up with sophisticated ways of disposing of its wastewater and sewage. Over the years, a vast network of sewage lift pumps had sprung up around large developments. The lift pumps moved sewage out of the neighborhoods and into treatment plants owned and operated by a company called CenterPoint. When the power was off, the pumps couldn't work. Sewage backed up. Stinking brown water bubbled up from manhole covers. Backyards turned to rivers of filthy, muddy slime. The air thrummed with a collective murmuring of vast clouds of mosquitoes and flies. After Hurricane Ike back in 2008, the same problem had led to 12 reported cases of West Nile virus. The answer, of course, was to get power back to the lift pumps. And to do that, relief workers had to physically climb into each station and connect it to a generator. They would then pump the station until it started yielding clean water again, and move on to the next station. But it was a monumental task, maybe even an impossible one under the present circumstances. CenterPoint had given him 24 generators, which was all they could find. Most of their equipment was still underwater, and probably would be for a very long time. And with those 24 generators, and the 20% of their workforce they could locate, CenterPoint was setting out to do the impossible. Of the city's 3 surface water treatment plants, 2 were currently underwater. The third was so badly damaged it would take months to bring it back online. Of the 75 core groundwater plants, all were currently offline. Of those, 52 would have to be completely rebuilt. Nothing was salvageable. None of the city's 6 pressure-boosting repump stations had survived. And the list just kept getting longer with every new report coming across Shaw's desk. Thinking about that lengthening list, Shaw almost missed what Robinson said next. "I just got off the phone with Jason Weeks over at CenterPoint," Robinson said. "He tells me that you have appropriated every single one of their generators." "Yes, sir, that's true." "It is?" Yes, sir.
And who, may I ask, gave you the authority to do that?
I'm not following you, sir.
You're not?
No, sir, I'm not. What seems to be the problem?
The problem? The problem? Captain, are you trying to be obtuse? Is that what's going on here? Do you think this is funny?
Sir, Shaw said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Last night I was on a bass boat touring the lower second ward, and I saw this dead little black baby caught in the branches of a pecan tree. Poor little guy wasn't wearing a stitch of clothes, his little arms just swaying back and forth in the floodwater. I could hear trapped people screaming for help in the attics of flooded houses. Everywhere you look, you see the bloated bodies of people and animals floating on the current. So to answer your question, no, I don't think any of this is funny. Robinson was quiet for a long moment. Look, he said, and his voice sounded more subdued now, the anger gone. All I'm asking is for you to release one of those generators. I know what you're up against, and You know? I'm sorry, sir, did you say you know what I'm up against? You have no fucking clue what I'm up against, Councilman. I'm sitting on an 80,000-person powder keg here. We're starving. Not hungry, mind you. Starving. I've got people dying because they can't get fresh water. I've got people dying of diseases that aren't even supposed to happen in this hemisphere. I'm up to my fucking chin in Major League death here. And you've got the balls to try to take a generator away from me just because your $20 million mansion smells like shit. Is that really what's going on here, Councilman? Now, hold on a second there, Captain Shaw. I understand that you're under a great deal of stress, but that does not give you the right to— I'll tell you what it gives me the right to do, Councilman. It gives me the right to tell you to go fuck yourself. Silence. It went on so long, Shaw almost hung up. But then Robinson answered, his voice seething with barely restrained hostility. My next phone call, Robinson said, will be to Chief Harper. I have known your boss for the last 15 years, and I guarantee you, Captain Shaw, that you have just cost yourself a job. You'll be replaced by the end of the day. Shaw actually laughed. Seriously? He said. Is that a promise, Councilman? I'll tell you what. If you find somebody stupid enough to do my job, you send them down here and I will personally hand them the keys. But until then, do us both a favor. Next time you get a case of the ass, save your phone calls for somebody else. Got it? Shaw hit the end key and threw the phone down on his desk. He stood there looking at it, aware that his staff had gone silent. They were all watching him. He took a few slow breaths, forcing the anger back down where it couldn't be seen. That might have gone better, Eleanor said. Like hell. Shaw let out a long breath. I shouldn't have baited him like that. Yeah, but it made you feel better, didn't it? He laughed. A little, yeah. You don't think Harper will really listen to him, do you? About relieving me? No. Or rather, he will eventually, but it won't be for a while. And he definitely wouldn't do it while we're still working this situation. Afterwards, yeah, he'll probably find some way to make all of this my fault. You don't sound too worried, she said. Fuck them, he said. Let 'em bring it if they can. He swept the room with an angry gaze. And you know what? Fuck it. I'm going out for another smoke. Keep an eye on things for me. Okay, she said. Oh, what about Dr. Bailey? Fuck Bailey. If he calls again, tell him I'm busy. Shaw went out to the front steps of the library, lit up another cigarette, and listened to the sounds of dogs baying in the night. Their cries were lonely, frightened. Most were starving. Perhaps a few had even realized the fate waiting for them. To Shaw, it was the sound of loyalty betrayed. It was a feeling he understood intimately. 6 years back he was commanding the Special Operations Unit, a division comprising all 5 of the department's SWAT units, the negotiators, and the bomb squad, while waiting for his appointment to deputy chief to finally come through. He'd been on top of the world. With one son on the job already, another in the academy, and his appointment to the command staff all but assured, he was creating a legacy, and he was going to be a patriarch. And then Grace got sick with breast cancer. Shaw's world slipped off its rails. He went from the hectic, high-powered world of city politics to the waiting rooms of doctors who were specialists in things he couldn't even pronounce. And for the first time in his adult life, Shaw found himself completely out of his depth. He took Grace to endless doctor's appointments. They did everything the doctors said to do. But in the end, the chemo and the drugs failed. They had caught the cancer late, and it moved through her hard and fast, relentless as an approaching winter. Utterly baffled by fate, Shaw turned in the only direction he could. He'd been brought up to believe the police department was a family. His fellow officers were his brothers and sisters, the department their mother and father. Even if the rest of the world was going to shit, an officer could always retreat inside the family that cared for him, and preserved him, and loved him. The fraternal brotherhood of police took care of its own. It was the core belief that had sustained him through 30 years of police service. It was the gospel he had preached to his 2 sons. It was the solace he sought now. And yet the brotherhood failed him in his time of need. Faced with the demands of competing for the appointment to deputy chief, and taking the time off to be with Grace as she slipped into the final stage of the disease, he'd done the only thing his conscience would allow him to do. He had friends on the command staff, and he tried to get them to go to bat for him. But it didn't work. Everybody felt sorry for him, sure, but if he wanted the appointment, they told him, he would have to slug it out with younger captains, all of them with graduate degrees, and the willingness to snuggle up in the embrace of the Houston political machine. That meant going to parties, playing golf with councilmen on the weekends, being seen, none of which he could do. He watched, from Grace's hospital bed, as first one, and then another, younger captain, moved into the command staff. And soon his only friends and supporters were the dinosaurs, all of them nearing the end of their careers. Their stroke with the city council and the puppeteers in the political machine all but dried up. When Grace died, Shaw found himself a wreck in more ways than one. The woman who had devoted her life to loving him and raising his sons was gone. She had been his rudder, and now he was floating without direction. In his youth, he had seen the department close ranks around officers in times of grief like his. But to his dismay, he found that times had changed. The brotherhood was not what it had once been. And in his floundering confusion, he was left feeling bitter, disgruntled, openly antagonistic toward the administration. They soon lost patience with him. Over the next year he was pushed farther and farther from the inner circle, until finally he was placed in the Emergency Operations Command. It was, perhaps, the cruelest blow imaginable, as it placed him under the direct command of the fire department's chief. It still rankled him, a cop working for a firefighter. The family, Shaw realized, had kicked him to the curb. They wanted him gone. Part of Shaw died with Grace. Not just his heart, not just his career, but his sense of worth, his sense of value. All of that was gone, and he was left standing in the wreckage, nursing his pride, and too bullheaded to admit he was beat. And now, as he stood on the stairs of the M.D. Anderson Library, listening to dogs bay in the night, he looked at his hands and realized his cigarette had smoldered down to the filter. He dropped the butt to the concrete and rubbed it out with the toe of his boot. Then he took another from his pack and lit it. Anthony showed up midway through his second cigarette. "You got another one of those?" he asked. Shaw handed him the pack and lit the cigarette for him. "Thanks," Anthony said. He was dressed in a green T-shirt tucked into battle-dress uniform pants. A floppy, boony hat pushed high up on his forehead, the way all the younger officers wore it these days. His shirt was snug enough to reveal his well-muscled, wiry frame. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a veteran SWAT officer, full of the knowledge that on the male hierarchy, he owned the top rung of the ladder. Back in his youth, Mark Shaw had been a founding member of Houston's SWAT unit. He recognized the swagger, the confidence in his son's body language, and it made him smile. But the smile didn't last long. He couldn't think of Anthony without thinking of his other son, Brent. Anthony had gotten his mother's small stature. He was only 5'9", and her striking good looks. Brent, on the other hand, was the spitting image of Shaw, a big bear of a man, several inches over 6 feet, with a barrel chest and a round face and a deep, clear voice. But that was where the similarities ceased. Anthony had gotten his father's drive, his mental toughness, his ability to make decisions under pressure. But not Brent. Brent, the older of the two, was a gentle giant. He rarely asserted himself, and lately had taken to drinking far too much. Shaw hadn't confronted him about the drinking, not yet anyway, but he had seen the signs of incipient alcoholism. The absences, the mood swings, the weak excuses for bad performance. Shaw knew it was yet another problem lurking in the wings, something he would have to confront as soon as all this other crap went away. Shaw pointed east over Anthony's shoulder. "Did you know your mother and I built our first house about a mile that way?" Anthony glanced back at the darkness, but said nothing. "It wasn't bad for a policeman's first house," he said. 2 bedrooms, a little yard with a garden. Your mom grew strawberries back then. I remember those things. Not like you buy in the store." He sighed. "I saw it last night. The house, I mean. It's under water mostly." Anthony blew out twin streams of smoke through his nostrils. "Nearly everything's underwater, Dad. This city's gone." Shaw took a drag of his smoke and nodded. For Mark Shaw, those flooded ruins out there weren't just houses. They were homes. Lives had been lived there. Houston, for all its corruption and faults, was a place where men could raise their families. They could live quiet lives, not of desperation, but of honor and integrity and devotion to the ones they loved. And that was it. Family. Everything grew out of the family. That was the concept that defined a man, and ultimately decided if his life had value. He wondered if Anthony understood that as well as he should. "You okay, Dad?" Anthony asked. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You sure? You look tired." "I am tired." Shaw took a last drag on his smoke, jammed it out on the handrail, then dropped it in disgust. Sometimes he hated cigarettes, even though he knew he'd be lighting up again in 10 minutes. "You're not going to have to worry about what's going on here in a few days," Anthony said. "We get that dynamite and we're home free. I've already scouted out the bank. It's perfect. The whole building's under water, just like Brent said. Once I get that dynamite, Jesse and I can be in and out of that vault in no time. Give me an hour, and we'll all be $7 million richer." "Yeah," Shaw said. He looked east into the darkened ruins, thinking about the house he and Grace had built all those years ago. Brent just a baby. But so much had happened since then. His sons had grown up, and Grace had died, and now he was facing a murky future. Without Grace, without his rudder, he'd fallen back on the one pillar that had never failed him: duty. The father was the provider. That was his duty. His job was to carve out a future for his children, by force if necessary. But provide for them he must do. To fail was not an option, even if it meant breaking his oath to the law. The day before Hurricane Hector, he had been talking with Brent about Brent's extra job as a security officer at the Republic of Texas Bank. Brent said that $7 million in cash was being stored in the bank's vault. Shaw had thought little of it until the day after Hurricane Hector, when he happened to read an action report that stated all of Southeast Houston's banks and jewelry stores and museums were now under water. The property loss, the report's author had written, will total in the trillions, maybe even the hundreds of trillions. Shaw had nodded in agreement. But the thought of $7 million waiting down there in the bowels of that flooded bank, already written off by the insurance companies, had started his mind working. He had 2 sons, both of whom had joined the police department because he had led them to it with his talk of honor and brotherhood. It was a good job, he promised. No matter how bad the economy gets, you'll never get laid off. But Shaw could read the writing on the wall. Houston would probably never recover from the twin scourge of Hector and Kyle, and if Hurricane Mardell hit them like the folks at the National Hurricane Center were saying, the city would be down and out for good. All his promises of good jobs forever would turn out to be a lie. And then, like a sign from heaven, the ATF delivered the Venezuelan freighter Santa Fe and its shipment of dynamite into his hands. The decision made itself. Shaw lit another cigarette, and it focused him back into the moment. "Are you and Jesse ready to move on the Santa Fe?" "Well, we can be. Not at this second, but we can be. We've still got a lot of planning to do." "You have 24 hours. 24 hours? Dad, holy shit, that's too soon." "You have 24 hours, Anthony, or the operation's a no-go. Got it? We wait any longer, and the feds are going to call in an FBI SWAT team. We've got a narrow window of opportunity here. I want you and Anthony to get your gear together and move out tomorrow morning with first light. Can you make it happen?" "Yeah," Anthony said, grinding his smoke out on the pavement. "Yeah, we can do it, but—" "That's all I wanted to hear," he said. "Get it done, Anthony. Just get it done." Chapter 3. The next morning, Brent Shaw sat behind the wheel of a small ski-boat, watching the flooded houses in the distance, trying his best not to think about the dead bodies he kept running over. His dad and his younger brother had promised him this little excursion was going to be quick and easy. So far, it had been anything but. "Okay, hold it up here," Anthony said. "Why are we doing this?" Brent said. "Dad said for us to get this done fast." "Just hold up, we'll get there." Anthony pumped his palm in Brent's face like an angry traffic cop. "Right here, stop!" The boat slowed, and Anthony leaned over the gunwale. "Oh, okay," he said. "No big deal. It's just a dummy." "A what?" "You know, like at the mall. A mannequin." Anthony reached into the water and scooped up a white arm with a limp plastic bag hanging from the wrist. Anthony pointed it at Brent. "See?" Brent stared at his brother, not the arm. "That's great, Anthony. Can we go now?" Brent didn't do well around dead bodies. That was no secret. Though he'd been a cop for close to 10 years now, the smell of decomposition could still make him vomit unexpectedly. And since riding out from their temporary HQ at the University of Houston's campus, they'd seen hundreds of blackened corpses floating in the water. Brent was in hell. But of course, Anthony was loving it. They'd run over several floaters already, and every time something thudded against the hull, Anthony would be ready with his one-liners. "Nice, 10 points!" Or Anthony's personal favorite, "Hey, go back, I think you missed one." Brent, meanwhile, would simply close his eyes and groan. The dummy's arm that Anthony was now holding up so proudly was just one more excuse for his younger brother to needle him. Anthony stuck the dripping arm around the side of the windscreen, the hand inching toward Brent's crotch.
"You want me to jack you off?" he said, speaking in a falsetto Vietnamese hooker voice. "Me got kung fu grip. Jack you off long time."
Brent swatted the hand away. "Jesus, cut it out." He wiped the water from his pants. "Quit laughing, asshole. What are you, like 6? He sat down again, his big hands draped over the top of the wheel. He was trying his best to look tough and pissed, but only came across as rattled.
"You got problem with your wee-wee, big boy?" Anthony said, still in his hooker voice. "You no like me? Come on, you not too buku for Rosie."
"I said cut it out."
"You sure? Rosie here's about as close as you're going to get to a woman for a while."
"Throw it back in the water," Brent said. "Please." "Fine," Anthony said, and threw the mannequin's arm away. "But you need to learn to have fun once in a while. Being with you is like having Eeyore for a brother." Anthony got up and went to the back of the boat, where Jesse Numeroff was giving their dive gear a final once-over. Brent watched him go, then hit the throttle and got them back on their way, trying his best not to think about the dull thuds he kept hearing against the bottom of the boat. "Hey, Brent, what's that?" They had just rounded a thick copse of trees. Ahead of them, a perfectly straight white line stretched across the floodwater. Brent killed the throttle and scanned the water ahead. "Shit," he said. "What is it?" Jesse Numeroff was coming forward now. He looked left, then right, following the track of the white line. "No way around it," Jesse said. "Looks like we're going to have to swim from here." Like Anthony, Jesse was short and slender and fast, built like an infielder. He and Anthony had been best friends since high school, where they played baseball together. Now he was a member of the Houston Fire Department's elite high-water rescue unit. When they were planning this operation, Anthony had suggested bringing in Jesse because of his dive skills, and their father, who had always liked Jesse, agreed without hesitation. And just like that, the three of them had fallen into the old familiar pattern. Anthony and Jesse were the Wonder Twins, the ones in charge. Brent was the chauffeur, the guy who carried the heavy stuff, the butt of their jokes. Anthony was standing beside Jesse now, looking at the white line in the water. "Okay, I give. What the hell is that?" "That's the retaining wall for the Beltway," Brent said. "The top of it, anyway. I can get you right up to it, but there's no way to get the boat over that without tearing up the hull." "Just go around it?" "It's too far," Brent said. "It'd take us an hour either way to get around it." "Be quicker to swim it," Jesse said. "The Santa Fe's about a mile that way, through those trees." "I guess we don't have any other choice, do we?" Anthony said. "Not really." Brent turned the boat to their right and followed the retaining wall until they came to a purple charter bus up to its rear-view mirrors in water. "I can tie off here pretty easy," he said to Jesse. "Will this be a good landmark for you to come back to?" "Yeah," Jesse said. "This'll work fine." Anthony and Jesse went to the back of the boat and donned their gear. As they climbed over the side, Brent said, "How long do you think this'll take?" 5 to 6 hours, I'm guessing," Anthony said. "You going to be okay hanging out here?" Brent nodded. "You sure?" Anthony said, smiling wickedly. "All those dead bodies? You're not going to get too spooked?" "Fuck you," Brent muttered. He grabbed a pair of AR-15s and handed them to Anthony, who passed one to Jesse. "Lighten up, big bro. I'm just funning with you. You shouldn't have any trouble. But just in case, like if a Coast Guard team shows up or something, have them call Dad at the EOC." "I know what to do," Brent said. And then, almost below his breath, "I can take care of myself." Anthony slid his goggles down over his eyes. "I know you can. I'm just telling you because the old man told me to. Oh, and steer clear of the trees. Water moccasins like to get up in there during floods." Brent glanced at the nearby oaks and swallowed. Anthony was still messing with his head, he knew that, but he couldn't help it. Snakes, like decomposing bodies, were one of his phobias. He turned back to Anthony and tried his best to sound confident and in control, like their father. "I got this, Anthony. You just do your part, and I'll do mine." Anthony laughed, gave him a thumbs up, and then he and Jesse slid away from the boat, gliding silently through the murky water. They dog-paddled most of the way to keep their legs out of the rubble that lurked just below the surface. Once they got out of earshot of the boat, Jesse said, "Hey, how did Brent's internal affairs case work out?" "Which one?" "There's another one?" Jesse asked. "I was talking about him being AWOL. Which one are you talking about?" "He wrecked his police car again." "No way, really? What is that, like 3 this year?" "The Crash Review Board gave him a 15-day suspension right before Gabriella. But my dad put it on hold until we see what's going to happen with Mardell." "That was cool of your dad." Anthony laughed. "He wasn't happy about it, that's for sure." "No, I bet not." They paddled on in silence. This close to the ship channel, they had a clear view of the damage Hurricane Kyle's storm surge had caused. Vast fields of garbage were strewn across the flooded landscape. Billboards were little more than skeletons, with only a few scraps hanging from them. Telephone poles had been upended and tossed like driftwood against buildings that had every window blasted out. Nothing moved, and there was no sound but the splashing of their feet as they dog-paddled on and on. They came to an 18-wheeler, and Jesse climbed up on top of the cab and looked east. "Not too much farther," he called down to Anthony. "There's a trailer park up ahead. Should be just on the other side of that." He climbed down and dropped into the water next to Anthony. "Hey," Jesse said, "listen, I gotta ask you something." "Shoot," said Anthony. "It's about Brent." "Yeah?" "Your dad's been covering for him a lot lately." "Yeah, so? You've known my dad long enough to know he's not going to let his kid down when he's going through a rough spot. That's not the kind of man he is." "I know that. I wouldn't have agreed to get on board with this little operation if I didn't know that." "So, what are you trying to say, Jesse?" "Well, it's just that it seems like Brent's been going through a little more than a rough spot. Seems like it's more serious than that." Anthony didn't answer. Though Jesse hadn't said the words out loud, they were back to Brent's drinking again. The subject had been coming up a lot lately, at work, at home, all the time. Brent had always been a heavy drinker, even back when they were in high school. But over the past year or so it had gotten way out of hand. From what Anthony had heard, Brent was calling in sick a lot, burning up his accrued leave bank. And there were other warning signs of bad things to come. Brent was obsessed with drinking. He talked about drinking all the time. He was irritable. They had grown apart since Anthony joined the SWAT unit, but on the few occasions they'd hung out recently, Brent had gotten really blitzed, followed by blackouts the next day. It was troubling to watch him struggle, completely unwilling to talk about what was obviously going wrong in his world. And Anthony didn't even want to think about the sudden rise in Brent's on-duty police car crashes. In the 7 years he'd been a policeman, Anthony had known more than a few cops who pickled themselves in booze. It was a common enough thing, considering all the shit your average street cop sees in his career. But even though it was common, and tolerated to some degree because nobody wanted to cut a fellow cop out of his pension, it was never cool. Drunks were taken off the street, pushed into some meaningless job where they didn't interact with the public, where they couldn't fuck anything up. Cops like that, they became pariahs, the department's black sheep. They were snickered at behind their backs. Eventually, they were forgotten. Anthony bristled at the idea that his own brother was on the verge of becoming one of those kinds of cops. It stirred a vague sense of hostility somewhere down in his guts, coiling like a big snake. "You think he's going to be able to do his part in this?" Jesse said. Anthony kept his eyes straight ahead. "He'll be fine," he said. "Hey, don't get upset, man. I'm just saying. I
I signed up for this because I trust you and your dad all the way. I respect you both. You're capable, but your brother, let's face it, Anthony, he's a drunk. I like him and all, but I don't want him to. It's not open for discussion, Jesse. He's in this with us. He's my brother, and I'm not going to leave him out of the money. I don't begrudge him the money, Jesse said. That's not what I'm driving at. He gets a share just like the rest of us. I'm cool with that. I'm just saying that, he might not be able to do his part in the operation. That's all I'm saying. He'll do fine. Now drop it. Jesse looked at him, then nodded slowly. Sure, he said. Okay. A short distance away they came upon the ruins of a trailer park. The destruction they had seen up to that point was incredible, though most of it was still under water, only the tops of buildings and cars still visible. The worst of it was left up to the imagination. But here, in this trailer park, which was at a slightly higher elevation than most of the surrounding area, the water had, for the most part, receded, and what was left was far worse than either of them had imagined. They rose to their feet as the water grew shallow, clipped their flippers to their belts between their legs, and walked through knee-high water, their heads on swivels as they scanned the wrecked trailer park. Several trailers were on their sides, tumbled together like a child's blocks. Some had been crushed by fallen trees. One was split nearly in half by a shrimp boat. Everywhere they looked, they saw endless piles of lumber and roof shingles. There wasn't an unbroken window anywhere. Tree limbs and leaves and brown sea plants clung to everything. And there were bodies. Lots of bodies. Mud had poured into one of the trailers and set like a lava flow. Inside, Anthony saw a mother with her arms still wrapped around a child, partially buried in the muck that had invaded their living room. Anthony looked upon the desolate scene, on the ruined trailers, the toys and lawn chairs, and the piles of gray, warped lumber, the broken windows so like eyes, the damp piles of leaves covering everything, and he felt a depression more complete than any he had previously thought possible. Those who knew him would never confuse Anthony for a deep thinker. Since boyhood, when he discovered that both baseball and girls came easily for him, little else occupied his thoughts. And so it surprised him to encounter such a complex web of feeling upon seeing this place. He was at once sickened and afraid. Turning his head slowly from one wrecked trailer to the next, he wondered what it was that was making him feel such dread, such loneliness, but he couldn't quite grasp it. Whatever it was that rattled him so was just out of reach, an elusive thing, a half-resolved and ominous it lurking in the darkness, waiting to put a cold hand upon his shoulder. With a tightness in his chest, and the stench of rot and open sewage seeping into his mask, he continued on. They saw a mangy black dog eating something that looked like a human leg. Anthony didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and dropped the animal with a single shot. And after the sound of that shot died away, Anthony stood watching the animal. Despite all he had seen, this was the worst. That dog, eating on a human corpse, somehow brought everything into focus. And in that instant he realized that he was witnessing the end of the first half of his life. Just like that. Abruptly, a strange memory surfaced in his mind. He remembered riding in his father's boat out on Clear Lake as a kid, the wind in his hair as he reached over the side, slapping the spray while his dad taught Brent to steer and work the throttle. They had passed a buoy, and Anthony, momentarily fascinated by it, had turned and asked his dad why it was there. "It's the dividing line," his dad had said, "between the lake and Galveston Bay. From here on out, we're in deep water." It was that last phrase that hung in Anthony's mind now. Deep water, he thought. Yeah, that was it. Deep water.
That dog eating that corpse's leg, it was like a buoy, and everything from here on out is deep water. There's no coming back from this. The city of Houston is dying, even if it doesn't know it yet. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye and turned toward it. "You see that?" he asked Jesse. He pointed to a trailer, the inside dark as a cave. "Over there." Jesse scanned the trailer. "No. What do you see?" "There's somebody in there." "I don't see him now." They were at a lower elevation now, the water up to their thighs. Jesse sank down into the water so that just his head was above water. "If it's a survivor, we'll pick him up on the way back," he said. "Come on. The ship should be just around those trees up there." Anthony's gaze lingered on the trailer a moment longer. Then he sank down into the water and followed after Jesse. They rounded a copse of trees, and there it was. The Santa Fe. It was an immense freighter, listing to one side, partially buried in mud and slag. Anthony grew up in Houston. He was no stranger to the large freighters that frequented the Houston ship channel, but always when he saw them on the nightly news, or while driving down to Galveston for a day at the beach, they had been in the water, the vast majority of their bulk, like an iceberg, out of sight below the surface. None of those memories prepared him for the Santa Fe. The storm surge had pushed it at least a mile inland from the docks. Its huge bulk stood like a monument to destruction on a vast field of mud. Even from 400 yards away, it caused the breath to hitch in his throat. His chest felt tight once again. His eyes were dry and burning beneath his mask. His hands felt cold, and an uncomfortable sweat popped from the skin on his arms. It was primitive fear, he realized, with a sudden flush of humility. Fear of this cathedral-like vastness rising from the mud, an endless jumbled plain of refinery wreckage. "Damn," he whispered. "Yeah, you ain't kidding." "Are we going to be able to find what we're looking for on that thing?" Anthony asked. "We will if the blueprints the ATF gave your dad are right. Of course, the way that thing's listing, everything could have gotten tossed around in there." They reached the ship and tossed their climbing ropes onto the deck. Both were experienced climbers, and there was little discussion until they had the ropes securely fastened to deck. It was then that Anthony happened to glance over his shoulder, back in the direction they'd come. There were people there, a small group, coming around the copse of trees. Anthony stared at them, and the vague, undefined sense of unease that had been nagging at him since they first entered the trailer park turned into a steady, blaring warning siren in his head. "You ready?" Jesse said. There was a pause. "Anthony?" "Huh?" "I said, are you ready?" Anthony pointed back in the direction from which they'd come. "Look over there. You see them?" The figures he was pointing at were too far away to make out any details. But even from where they stood, Anthony could see that their clothes had been ripped to pieces by the wind and the rain, revealing emaciated arms and stick-like legs. And there was something wrong with the way they moved. They seemed stiff, their movements jerky, unnatural. "What's wrong with them?" he said. "Survivors, I guess," said Jesse. "If they've been out here since Kyle, they're probably starving." "What do you want to do?" Anthony forced down his unease. One thing he had inherited from his dad was the ability to focus when things started to unravel. Right or wrong, his father had always said, you make a decision and you go with it. The worst thing you can do is sit there with your thumb up your ass, wondering what to do. "We have to finish this," he said. "My dad said we only get one chance to handle this ourselves before the FBI sends in their people." "Yeah, but what about them?" Jesse said, with a nod toward the approaching survivors. "We'll get 'em on our way out. Come on, let's go up." They climbed the ropes quickly, Anthony reaching the deck first. He turned and extended a hand to Jesse. Need some help?" "From a swat puke?" Jesse said. "Not hardly." Anthony waited for Jesse to climb over the railing. Then the two of them, flat on their bellies, looked across the deck. Though Anthony knew little about large ships, he had read some Clive Cussler books, and that little bit of knowledge helped him feel like he was at least somewhat familiar with his surroundings. The boat was probably 800 feet long, her beam 100 feet. There were 7 derricks, all but one forward of the funnel and superstructure, leaning like terracotta warriors over the deck holds, waiting to unload cargo that would never again see the light of day. The deck itself was a wasteland of oil drums and tools and rusted equipment. The Santa Fe, evidently, had not been in very good shape even before getting beached by Hurricane Kyle's storm surge. Anthony could see patches of rust and flaking paint on the bulkheads and superstructure. Here and there, he caught a glimpse of a porthole leering back at them like a cracked and yellowed eye. "Where to?" Anthony said. Jesse pointed to their left. "The superstructure up there. We can get down into the hold from there." Anthony nodded and fell in behind Jesse, and they worked their way to the superstructure. They were dropped into darkness as soon as they stepped inside the bulkhead. Turning on their flashlights, they found the stairs and made the awkward downward descent. The deck below them tilted at a crazy angle, so that they had to walk on the walls and on the railing. Garbage had fallen down, or up, it was hard to tell, the stairs. It had piled up so high in places that they had to get their shoulders behind a big piece of it and muscle it out of the way. The first time they did it, a large metal cooler went tumbling down the stairs with all the subtlety of a fire truck trying to force its way through traffic. When at last the echoes of it died off in the darkness, Jesse looked at Anthony and said, "Well, there goes stealth mode." Anthony laughed, and they pushed on. The cargo level, when at last they reached it, had 5 feet of water in it. The hold was pitch black, except where their flashlight beams lanced into the darkness. It was ungodly hot down here, and so humid Anthony could feel it in his throat. But the smell was the worst. Something was dead down here. He would have pulled his shirt up over his mouth if it too hadn't been soaking up the filth around them. "This doesn't look good," he said. "No," agreed Jesse. "Come on. I think we need to go that way." Jesse pointed his flashlight into the bowels of the hold, revealing a length of metal railing and the ribs of the ship, and a jumbled mess of crates and shattered pallets. And then, in the light, something moved, followed by a heavy splash. "Fuck! What was that?" Anthony said, simultaneously swinging his AR-15 into position. He hit the flashlight button below the barrel, and a bluish-white LED lit up the section of railing where they had seen the movement. "I lost it," Jesse said. "You see it?" "No." "What was that?" "How the fuck should I know? Just stay ready. Cover right, I got left." Jesse pulled up beside him, his own AR-15 now at the ready. "Clear?" Anthony asked. "Yeah, clear." "Police officers!" Anthony shouted into the darkness. "We are armed! Identify yourselves, or you will be shot!" They waited, still scanning the darkness with the LED flashlights mounted on their rifles. Jesse's flashlight happened to catch the reflected glint of a pair of eyes, and both men swung their weapons toward it. A rat, soaking wet and glistening from the sheen of oil on the water, glared malignantly at them from atop a wooden crate. "Fucking rat," Jesse said. "That was no rat," Anthony said. "Whatever that was, it was a whole lot bigger than a fucking rat." Again they scanned the darkness, listening for the sound of splashing, or anything else for that matter. But whatever they had seen was gone now. Anthony motioned for Jesse to lead on, and the two of them moved slowly forward, weapons at the ready as they searched for the crates from Tsing Tsai Chemical that held the ammonia gelatin. They found them a short distance forward, half submerged. "Is that going to be a problem?" Anthony asked. "Being all wet like that?"
"It's an underwater explosive, you jackass. What do you think?"
Jesse reached into a pocket of his BDUs and pulled out a lock-blade knife, which he used to cut into the plastic sheet that covered the dynamite sticks. Anthony stared at the explosives, and his mouth went dry. He tried to swallow, but couldn't force down the walnut that had suddenly formed in his throat. They were sitting on dynamite, for Christ's sake. The next thing he knew, Jesse had pulled from his pants pocket a device that looked like an old-fashioned transistor radio. He also had a small Ziploc baggie with a length of copper wire inside. As Anthony watched, Jesse connected the transistor radio-looking device to the wires, and then the wires into a few of the sticks of dynamite. Then he pulled out 5 sticks and motioned for Anthony to turn around.
"What are you doing?"
Anthony asked, but he knew even before he asked. He could feel Jesse tugging at the zipper to his backpack, working the flaps open to get the dynamite crammed down into the pouch.
"Relax," said Jesse. His voice was breezy. "These things won't explode without a detonator."
Jesse zipped the backpack closed again and went back to working on the rest of the dynamite still inside the crate.
"So what are you doing there?"
Anthony asked. "Attaching a detonator." The walnut at Anthony's throat finally went down. With a chuckle, Jesse finished the job and stood up. "Come on," he said. "Let's get moving."
"Just like that? That's it?"
"Yep, that's it. I'll activate the charges once we get to a safe distance.
When you hit the detonator, there won't be any danger with the—"
He trailed off there, but motioned with his thumb toward the dynamite in his backpack. Jesse smiled. "Stop being such a pussy," he said, slapping Anthony on the shoulder. "Come on, let's get moving." They made their way back to their stairs and started up. Anthony was still tense, the smell of death strong in his nostrils, and he kept his AR-15 at the low ready. Up ahead of them, a hazy white daylight seeped down from the top of the stairs. Anthony kept his gaze moving, careful not to stare into the light too long, so that his eyes wouldn't lose their low-light acuity. But the sweat was popping out all over his face, and it was hard to tell if the flickering light above them was coming from his rapid blinking, or something moving. He stopped and ducked into a crouch. Jesse continued a few steps up, then stopped as well.
"You hear something?"
he whispered.
"Shh."
Anthony listened. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again and slowly scanned the darkness. He had heard something. What was it? The faint clicking of fingernails on a table? Or was it simply the distant, muffled plink, plink, plink of water dripping from a bulkhead somewhere down in the hold? It was hard to tell. The sound, if indeed it had been a sound at all, had seemed to come from above him and below him simultaneously. But now, in the darkened stillness of the stairwell, all he could hear was the slow, measured sound of his own breathing. "I don't hear anything," Jesse said, and stood up. "Come." In the low light, something moved fast behind Jesse. There was a crash, a sudden stuttering growl that sounded like a fast series of notes on a piano keyboard, and something that was all teeth flashed into the air, lunging for Jesse's head. Anthony was ready and fired, the stairwell turning orange from the muzzle flash, the pop-pop-pop of the rifle echoing off the walls. A moment later, the afterburn of the muzzle flash still sending white blobs of light sailing across his vision, Anthony lit up the crumpled form at their feet. It was a dog, its ribs visible down the flanks of its mangy coat, teeth still bared in a grimace of mad hunger. Jesse, meanwhile, was leaning against the wall, staring down at the animal. He looked at Anthony, said nothing, then looked back down at the dog.
"You okay?"
Anthony said.
"What is it with you and dogs?"
Jesse answered.
"Shit, man, I think I streaked my shorts."
Anthony shook his head. "Yeah, you and me both. Come on, let's go." They climbed the stairs back to the deck and found their ropes. As Anthony was climbing over the side, he happened to glance to the north and saw the 5 survivors they'd seen earlier. They were very close now, less than 200 feet from the ship. Close enough that Anthony could hear them moaning. "Jesse, over there," he said. "Shit, they're way too close. Anthony, we have to get them out of here. They need to be at least 1,000 yards from the blast point." "Start down," Anthony said. Then he turned to the approaching figures, cupped his hands over his mouth to trumpet his voice, and yelled, "You there! Stop! The ship's not safe! Don't come any closer! We'll come to you!" He was about to yell again, for they didn't seem to hear him. But then he dropped his hands from his mouth. Something was wrong. They didn't move right. They didn't sound right. From where he stood he could see their eyes, and it seemed to him that he had seen that same vacancy, that same profound emptiness, in the sightless, unblinking stare of the freshly dead. The man out in front of the pack was nearly nude. His pants and shoes and most of his shirt and the left side of his underwear little more than tattered rags. He didn't walk. He shambled. His arms hung like limp ropes at his side. His lower jaw worked up and down, but never completely closed. There was a clumsy, faltering stagger to his walk. But it was the man's eyes that held Anthony's attention. Those glassy, depthless eyes. 3 years earlier, Anthony had been on a high-risk narcotics search warrant. He was the lead man into the house after Russell Marks smashed the door open with a battering ram. There, not 8 feet from the door, sitting on a couch, were 3 grown men and a grubby-looking, half-naked junkie girl of about 14. "Down! Down! Police! Search warrant!" Anthony had screamed, and saw one of the men rise from the couch with a pistol in his hands. Instinct took over, and he fired a 3-round burst. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still follow the track of the bullets as they left his gun and thudded into the man's chest and neck, knocking him back against the filthy gray wall behind him. The man had slid down to the couch and rolled over forward, landing face up on the bare cement floor at Anthony's feet. Anthony looked down at the man, watching the life slip out of his frightened gaze, watching his face grow slack, horrified, and even a little thrilled that he had just killed a man who was trying to kill him. The look Anthony had seen in that man's eyes as he died was the same look he was seeing now. A loud, ululating moan rose up from the lead man in the group, and it snapped Anthony back into the moment. He grabbed onto the ropes and swung himself over the side, a small but insistent voice in his head, urging him to go, go, go. He and Jesse landed in the mud side by side. Jesse unhooked himself from the rope and started to walk toward the group, which was now almost upon them. "Jesse, no!" Anthony said, and Jesse turned his head slightly back to Anthony, as though startled by the urgency in his friend's voice. "Back away!" Anthony shouted. Jesse turned back to the approaching group, just as the lead man raised his hands and tried to grab Jesse by the shoulders. The man's mouth came open, the moan still bleeding out, but changing now into something more like a wet, snapping sound. Anthony was already running toward them. He had the butt of the AR-15 raised over his head, and as he closed the distance, he slammed it down on the man's face. The blow cracked the man's teeth off at the gum line and knocked him to the ground. "He tried to bite me," Jesse said. His eyes were wide, his mouth slack with disbelief. "Did you see that? He was going to take a bite out of me." But Anthony wasn't listening to Jesse. He was watching the man on the ground. An injury like that should have had the guy rolling around, screaming his lungs out. But he was getting back up, and he wasn't making a sound. Blood was gushing from his mouth, his teeth little more than icicle-like stubs now, and he was getting up.
Anthony shook his head. No, he thought. Not possible. Not fucking possible. Move, he said, grabbing Jesse by the shirt and pushing him away from the people closing in on them. Time to go. They moved as fast as they could through the mud, their flippers swinging wildly between their legs as they ran. Anthony glanced back over his shoulder. The survivors were turning slowly, stiffly, to follow them. But they didn't run. They didn't change their pace at all. They just kept shambling on. What the hell's wrong with those people? Jesse asked. I don't know, Anthony answered. Just keep moving. Don't stop. And they didn't. Not until they rounded the copse of trees and came upon the edge of the trailer park. At that point, Jesse reached into his pants pocket and pulled out the transistor radio-looking device and flipped it on. What do you want to do? Jesse said. Those people are too close. I hit this thing, they're going to die. Anthony nodded slowly. He knew that already. But his mind was replaying the things he'd just seen, the man getting up without saying a word, or showing even the slightest sign that he'd been hurt after having his teeth knocked down his throat, the dead vacancy in his eyes. He heard a faint splashing to his right, and turned. Anthony had just enough time to remind himself that the first dog he'd shot had landed over there, near that pile of gray, weathered lumber. But what he saw there now, his mind refused to acknowledge. 3 women, the clothes on their backs the same color as the mud on the sides of the trailers, were using their teeth and their fingernails to rip the dog's carcass to pieces. One woman turned her head slowly around, ropey lengths of muscle and fur hanging from her lips, and rose to her full height. She started toward them. "Oh, shit, Anthony," said Jesse. Anthony stared at the woman, transfixed by her, at the blood that had formed a wide, ghastly bib down the front of her tattered dress. For a long moment he couldn't wrap his mind around her. It was all just too much to take in. But then he saw her eyes, the same dead, vacant eyes he'd seen on the man back at the ship, and a low groan escaped his lips. "Hit it, Jesse. Blow the charge. Do it!" "Yeah," Jesse muttered. And then, louder, "Get ready to drop." Jesse hit the button on the detonator. Both men dropped to their knees, opened their mouths to equalize the pressure, and braced themselves for the blast. The first explosion came a second later. It was a small blast, muffled by the hull of the ship. Anthony thought, "Is that it?" He was about to open his eyes when the next several blasts came, one after the other, so close together they might have seemed like a single blast if heard from a distance. The blast wave washed over them a moment later. Anthony was facing toward the boat when it hit. He saw an enormous wall of fire rise up over the trees, huge curtain-like sheets of red, yellow, and orange rising into the sky. A low rumble moved through the ground, causing the trailers around them to jitter